I'm going to just then divide my presentation into two parts, which fit quite logically in what the discussions relate to. And first of all, I'll say some words about how I perceive the US-Russia relationship to be at the moment, how the reset, where we are and our perceptions of the reset. And then secondly, I'll look at the various implications for Latvia within Europe and indeed to a certain extent for the transatlantic community as a whole. Perhaps I can just say at the beginning that although recently a researcher at Carnegie described me as being a Cold War warrior, I'd just like to declare from the outset that my views concerning Russia and Russia and NATO, I have expressed them fairly clearly on numerous occasions, and so I just want to repeat that vis-à-vis Russia, I'm very much in favour of practical engagement with Russia that should be result-orientated and should be based on mutual respect and transparency. And there I'm probably talking, more about sort of NATO-EU relations with our important partner Russia. I think that we, Latvia, have indeed we are able to give some positive input to our NATO and EU partners when we discuss this relationship. And I would also like to say something that I have gone on the record as saying in the past, is that because it's still, interestingly enough, a question that does crop up, and that's the question of whether Russia should be a member of NATO. We just had a meeting with the newly accredited ambassador of Cyprus to Latvia, and when he was discussing relations with Turkey, he said that Cyprus would be extremely happy if Turkey would be a member of the European Union. That would be in the security interests of Cyprus. And the same parallel, of course, goes with Russia, because if Russia reaches the stage of democracy that all other current members of the alliance have reached, then I think we can only welcome the possible prospects of Russia being a member of the alliance. And it would be indeed the fact that Article 10 of the Washington Treaty would then have come into effect. There would be a unanimous decision by all existing members at that time. So democracy, compliance with human rights, they would be very welcome. Let me now say then a few words about how I perceive the reset to be where we are. I want to quote a Western film called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Those of you from the United States will of course remember there was this film in the 60s, 70s, a great Western with Clint Eastwood starring. And so I see the reset policy as being the good, the bad and the ugly. What is the good? I think it's quite clear that the good relates to the fact that that we have a new START treaty. This is excellent news. It's excellent news not only for US-Russia relations, but and it has been referred to as the cornerstone of US-Russia relations. It meant a large reduction, or plans for a reduction of warheads to 1,550 within 7 years. And at the summit in Lisbon in November, at the time of the summit, Latvia's foreign minister was one of a group of foreign ministers who called for a speedy Senate ratification of the START treaty, because, as we recall, there were the elections, midterm elections in November, and there was concern that if there was a delay with ratification, it may not go through with the new Senate. So Liegis Christos actually appealed with a number of other NATO foreign ministers for the Senate to give early approval. And as we also know, the treaty came into effect a few months ago when Secretary Clinton exchanged with Lavrov at the Munich conference. So the START treaty, I think, is part of the good. The other part of the good, to my mind, is relates to cooperation on Afghanistan. Cooperation on Afghanistan and in particular the transit of goods, and I'll be speaking a little bit later about the implications of that for Latvia in particular, is particularly good news. I was in a discussion with some colleagues from the Carnegie Endowment here in Riga a couple of months ago, and it was interesting to hear about how it was the effect of 9/11, the call by President Putin to President Bush, the telephone call after the time of 9/11, and then some consultations between high officials in Moscow relating to the future operations in Afghanistan. And it was this period of positive cooperation that led to agreement for the transit of non-military goods through Russia and indeed through Latvia's port to the operation in Afghanistan. And if we also look at very recent developments, there have been discussions in Brussels about on the level of the NATO-Russia Council about engagement by the NATO-Russia Council in a helicopter trust fund to assist the Afghan army in the maintenance of helicopters. So Russia is clearly on board with that element as well. The bad, so that's the good to my mind. Now for the bad. I think that part of the bad is the ambivalent Russian reaction to the events of the Arab Spring. We had an expert on the Middle East from Israel coming through Riga a few weeks ago, and he was fairly critical and concerned, certainly from the Israeli perspective, about how Russia has responded to these events. And I suppose the slightly good news is that Russia did not veto the UN Security Council resolution, but had an abstention. But it does seem that there is, from the part of Russia, more support for Islamic radicalism than there is for the genuine democracy or democratic movements that seem to be emerging in these countries. Another element of the bad, to my mind, is the fact that the CFE, conventional forces in Europe, negotiations are essentially stalled at the moment. For Latvia, what has been particularly important in the CFE negotiations, given that we're not currently a party to the amended treaty, is that there was a united NATO negotiating position in the discussions on CFE. Of course, we've had close cooperation and consultations with Victoria Nuland, who has been assigned by the US administration to handle these discussions, but this treaty, which has also been quoted as being a cornerstone of security in Europe, unfortunately seems to be not moving anywhere at the moment. There's objections to the position that NATO is putting forward, including towards the host nation support issue. The other bad element, I would say, although this is something that is still, the jury is still out, relates to the question of missile defence. We had a very important positive result from the Lisbon summit, with the first time that NATO had a presidential attendance by President Medvedev in Lisbon, and there was an NRC NATO-Russia council meeting at heads of state and government level, and that was very positive. There was a call through both the strategic concept and the declaration made by the NATO-Russia Council in Lisbon, and also the declaration by the heads of government of NATO, that referred to cooperation between Russia on the one hand and NATO on the other hand vis-à-vis missile defence. And I would say that this is in many ways the litmus test of the NATO Russia and the US-Russia relationship at the moment. There were discussions only last week at the level of the chairman of the defence of NATO member states in Russia, and it still seems to be the impression that for Russia, vis-à-vis the NATO-Russia relationship, this is a bit of a zero-sum game, where they say, well, if we can't agree on this issue, then forget NATO-Russia relations. I mean, to my mind, that's a bit of a bluff, and they are negotiating hard to get what they can. But essentially, the talk on the missile defence is about cooperation, and we would also, of course, be happy to have an agreement on this cooperation, certainly on the basis that the sovereignty of all member states of the alliance is not adversely affected.